Hey, what's up, A-Bush kids? We're back for our next lecture here in AP US History. Today we have topic 6.6, the development of the middle class. Our learning objective today is 6H, explain the causes of increased economic opportunity and its effects on society. Two key ideas to start us off with today, and the first one says, social commentators advocated theories later described as social Darwinism to justify the success of those at the top of the socioeconomic structure as both appropriate and inevitable. And number two, some business leaders argue that the wealthy had a moral obligation to help the less fortunate and improve society, as articulated in the idea known as the gospel of wealth. And they made philanthropic contributions that enhanced educational opportunities and urban environments. So these two ideas are going to be ways in which monopolists will justify their wealth. The first one, as we've already mentioned, is the gospel of wealth, and it argued generally that it was God's will for some men to gain great wealth so that they could serve the public. Now, in addition to this, social Darwinism taught that natural competition weeded out the weak and allowed the strong to survive. In addition to this, the government used laissez-faire policies towards big business. Now, what laissez-faire means is a lack of regulation, and this allowed businesses to become very powerful as well as exploitative to not only their workers, but to also the environment and to the government as well. The first of these theories that we're going to really dive into is that of social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism was based on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. And in his theory of evolution, this then became applied to humans, and in it, the struggle between workers and employees. Now, the general idea was that this held that society should do as little as possible to interfere with a person's success, and that evolutionary forces would allow some people and some businesses to thrive and survive, and businesses and people that were less able to adapt to new situations or to the environment would fail. And this was then used as a justification for why certain businesses would become successful and certain people would become successful, and that certain businesses and people would fail and be unsuccessful. It wasn't because of poor management or better ideas or technology or ruthless business tactics. It was the law of nature that was allowing different groups to survive and to thrive and others to completely fail. In addition to this, another justification for wealth was what we call the gospel of wealth. Now, this was written by the Santa Claus looking figure that you see in the bottom left-hand side. That's Andrew Carnegie. Now, Andrew Carnegie was one of the most wealthy men in America. In fact, he was one of the wealthiest men to ever live. As the owner of the U.S. Steel Corporation, he was incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful. And the book was a justification for his wealth, but also a call to action for other large business owners and what they should do with their wealth. Now, the gospel of wealth was based on these ideas of social Darwinism that we talked about just a slide ago. And it said the wealthy had an obligation to help the needy in society. Now, it also certainly said that the rich deserved their wealth. But it also said that the wealthy needed to help society. And what this led to was many wealthy business owners starting philanthropic organizations and donating money to charity during their lifetimes. And this is something that we oftentimes see with the mega rich today. For instance, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation very much follows this idea of the gospel of wealth, this idea that it's okay for those two people to be some of the richest people on the planet, but they're going to give back to society as part of this kind of gospel of wealth to help the needy in society as well. Now, Carnegie, for instance, doesn't pay his workers very much, doesn't allow unions in his factories, but as part of the gospel of wealth, he's going to give money to New York City libraries, to colleges, to performing art institutions. You've probably heard of his famous Carnegie Hall. So it's this gospel of wealth idea, right? Where it justifies his poor treatment But on the other hand, he's going to be giving money into philanthropic works. And he gives a ton of money. He distributes more than $350 million of his fortune to support libraries, universities, different public institutions across the country. Right? For instance, here's the Carnegie Library in Kansas City, Kansas. All right? And then here's the other one that is in Chicago, Illinois. Now, Rockefeller, very much the same way. Now, Rockefeller takes his gospel of wealth to heart as well. He takes advantage of his workers. He uses his fortune to influence the government. His wealth is justified through social Darwinism. However, he also gives away tons of money, $500 million to charities. He creates the Rockefeller Foundation. He founds the University of Chicago. Right? All of these are part of this idea of the gospel of wealth based on the idea of social Darwinism, the justification for the incredible wealth and power of these men. Leading us then to key ideas 3 and 4. Key idea 3 says corporations' need for managers and for male and female clerical workers, as well as increased access to educational institutions, fostered the growth of a distinctive middle class. A growing amount of leisure time also helped expand consumer culture. And key idea 4 says as the price of many goods decreased, workers' real wages increased, providing new access to a variety of goods and services for Americans' standard of living improved, while the gap between the rich and the poor grew. And this was certainly true, and something that we talked about in the last video about the growth of these large businesses. Large businesses needed these middle managers, and so the middle class certainly grew. And as such, their ability to spend money grew as well. The increased output of U.S. factories, as well as the invention of new consumer products, prompted businesses to find ways of selling their merchandise to a large public. R.H. Macy in New York and Marshall Field in Chicago made large department stores the place to shop in urban centers, while Frank Woolworth's 5 and 10-cent stores brought nationwide chain stores to the towns and urban neighborhoods. 2 large mail-order companies, Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward, used the improved rail system to ship rural customers everything from hats to houses ordered from their thick catalogs, which were known to millions of Americans as the Wish Book. Now, packaged foods under such brands as Kellogg and Post became common items in American homes. Refrigerated railroad cars and canning enabled Gustav Swift and other packagers to change the eating habits of Americans with mass-produced meat and vegetable products. Swift's famous line, and from his mass production, was that he used everything but the squeal. And advertising and new marketing techniques not only promoted a consumer economy, but also created a consumer culture in which shopping became a favorite pastime. Now, by the 1800s, the richest 10% of U.S. population controlled 90% of the nation's wealth. Industrialization created a new class of millionaires, some of whom flaunted their wealth by living in ostentatious mansions, sailing enormous yachts, and throwing lavish parties. The Vanderbilts graced the waterfront of Newport, Rhode Island with summer homes that rivaled the villas of European royalty. Guests at one of their dinner parties were invited to hunt for their party favors by using small silver shovels to seek out the precious gems hidden in the sand on long silver trays. Many Americans ignored the widening gap between the rich and poor. They found hope in the examples of the self-made man in businesses such as Andrew Carnegie and Thomas Edison, and novels by Horatio Alger Jr. Every Alger novel portrayed a young man of modest means who became wealthy through honest, hard work and a little luck. In reality, opportunities for upward mobility, movement into the higher economic brackets, did exist, but a rags-to-riches career of an Andrew Carnegie was unusual. Statistical studies demonstrate that the typical wealthy business person of the day was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male who came from an upper middle-class background and whose father was in business or in banking. Now, the growth of large corporations required thousands of white-collar workers, salaried workers whose jobs generally did not involve manual labor, to fill the highly organized administrative structures. Middle management was needed to coordinate the operations between the chief executive and the factories. In addition, industrialization helped expand the middle class by creating jobs for accountants, clerical workers, and salespersons. In turn, the middle-class employees increased the demand for services from other middle-class workers, professionals such as doctors and lawyers, public employees, and storekeepers. The increase in the number of good-paying occupations after the Civil War significantly increased the size of the middle class. Now, by 1900, two-thirds of all working Americans worked for wages, usually at jobs that required them to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Wages were determined by the law of supply and demand, and because there was usually a large supply of immigrants competing for factory jobs, wages were barely above the level needed for bare subsistence. Therefore, working-class families depended on the income of women and children. In 1890, 11 million of the 12 million families in the United States averaged less than $380 a year in income. One adult woman out of every 5 in 1900 was in the labor force working for wages. Most were young and were single. Only 5% of married women worked outside the home. In 1900, men and women alike believed that if a family could afford it, a woman's proper role was in the home raising children. Factory work for women was usually in industries that people perceived as an extension of the home. The textile, garment, and food processing industries, for example. As the demand for clerical workers increased, women moved into the formerly male occupations as secretaries, bookkeepers, typists, and telephone operators. Occupations or professions that became feminized, women became the majority, usually lost status and received lower wages and salaries. In addition to this, the price of goods during this time also went through a significant decline. As industrialization increased, the cost to produce 1 unit of a good decreased, thus making goods relatively cheaper. And although we saw wages not always increasing, real wages increased. And that we mean that people could now buy more with the same amount of money. The rise in the middle class also led to a rise in a distrust of the trusts. The trusts had come under widespread scrutiny and attack in the 1800s. Middle-class citizens feared the trust's unchecked power, and urban elites, the old wealth, resented the increasing influence of the new rich. After failing to curb trusts on the state level, reformers finally moved Congress to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which prohibited any contract combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraining trade or commerce. Although federal law against monopolies was now on the books, it was too vaguely worded to stop the development of trusts in the 1890s. Furthermore, the Supreme Court in the United States versus E.C. Knight Corporation in 1895 ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act could be applied only to commerce, not to manufacturing. As a result, the U.S. Department of Justice secured few convictions until the law was strengthened during the Progressive Era. In addition, Congress created what was called the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887 to regulate the railroad industry. Now, this was the first attempt by the federal government to regulate big businesses, and what became known as the ICC became the model for future regulatory agencies. However, this would not happen until the early 1900s. For most of the rest of the 1800s, the ICC was actually controlled by the railroad industry, who used it as a tool to strengthen their own power. Well, that's all our notes for today. A few things to review with you before we let you guys go. Understand that large business owners, such as Andrew Carnegie and Rockefeller, justified their wealth through ideas such as social Darwinism and the gospel of wealth. And the rising middle class during this time period also went through a significant change, as rising real wages led to changes in the family structure, as well as their ability to buy goods increased during this time, and the availability of goods also increased during this particular time. Well, until next time, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and as always, go Pack.